The pollen grain sticks on the body of the butterfly again moves up and it will sit on this particular stigma. If it is not of the same species, then the pollen grains will get rejected. The anthers are not exposed, then the wind cannot easily swipe off or carry the pollen grains. Water pollinated flowers occur in hydrophytes. They are the plants that reside or that dwell in the water. Hello everyone, welcome to another session on sexual reproduction in flowering plants. I am Dr. Divya, Biology faculty, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysuru, a temple of excellence. So in the previous session, we had studied about the pre-fertilization events that occurs in a flowering plant in terms of sexual reproduction. So, in pre-fertilization events, we had studied the pre-fertilization events that occurs in the male gametophyte, that is the microsporogenesis, and the pre-fertilization events that occur in the female gametophyte, that is the megasporogenesis. And I told you that after the pre-fertilization events, if the fertilization has to occur inside an embryo sac, which is called as double fertilization, then the pollen grains that were formed during the pre-fertilization event has to be carried from the anther to the stigma of another flower or of the same flower. So, if the pollen grains has to be carried from the anther to the stigma, then various agents will help in doing so. So, in this particular session, we will study about pollination and what are the different agents that help in bringing about pollination in a flowering plant. So, pollination. So, pollination is nothing but the process of transfer of pollen grains. Where are the pollen grains being present? They are present in the anther. So, once the anthers inside the anther, the pollen grains mature, the anthers will dehisce or split open and the pollen grains will start to come out. So, once the pollen grains are released by the anther, the pollen grains are carried from the stigma to the pistil. So, the process of transfer of pollen grains that are shed from the anther to the stigma of a pistil is called as pollination. So, here what happens is, so when the pollen grains, they mature inside the anthers, they dehisce or they split open and they start to liberate the pollen grains. So, whatever pollen grains have come out of the anther will be carried by different agents, be it biotic agents or be it abiotic agents, they will be carried onto the stigma of another flower. So, this particular process is called as pollination. So, in pollination, there are different types of pollination. So, depending on what is the source of the pollen, the pollination is of three types. So, depending on source or depending on how pollination occurs, it is of three types. So, the first one is called as autogamy. So, the first one, it is called as autogamy. The second one, it is Geitonogamy, and one more kind of pollination we have, it is called as Xenogamy. So, what is this autogamy, Geitonogamy and Xenogamy we will study in detail. So, first we will learn about autogamy. So, auto means self, gamy, the fusion of the gametes. So, how the gametes fuse? You know that the pollen grains, inside the pollen grain, you have the two male gametes. The male gametes will be deposited or delivered into the female gametophyte, and that is how the fertilization will occur. Here, in autogamy, auto means self. So, what happens in autogamy? The pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. So that is why it is called as autogamy. So autogamy can also be called as self-pollination. So here the pollination occurs in the same flower. So in this diagram or in this image, you can see that you have the stigma and you have the anthers. So here the stigma and the anther is present in the same flower. So what happens is, can you see here, there is pollen grains deposited on the stigma. So these pollen grains will be deposited. So you can see here the pollen grains deposited on the anther. So these pollen grains will be carried from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. In the one flower itself, you have the because this is a bisexual flower. So what is a bisexual flower? In bisexual flower, you'll have the male reproductive structure, that is the anther, and the female reproductive structure, that is the gynoecium. In this case, the stigma here, which is very important for pollination, they are present in the same flower. So in this particular flower, in the same flower itself, from the anther, the pollen grains will be transferred or deposited onto the stigma. So this particular process is called as autogamy, or it is called as self-pollination. It is also called as self-pollination. So, in autogamy or self-pollination, the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. So, autogamy or self-pollination can take place in two types of flower. Here, the flower can either be open type or the flower can either be of closed type. So, autogamy can occur in chasmogamous flower and cleistogamous flower. So what is chasmogamous flower? So chasmogamous flower, they have exposed stigma and anther. So they are exposed, means they are open. So you can see here, this is the best example of a chasmogamous flower. So here the petals and all are free. The petals and all are not covering the stigma or the anther. The stigma and the anther are exposed to pollination, or they are exposed to the pollinators. So therefore easy pollination can occur. In chasmogamous flower, when the anthers and the stigma are exposed, the bees or whatever insect, they can come and sit on the pollen grain. So the bee, so I'll take the example of a pollinator here. I'll take the example of a butterfly, for example. So the butterfly can come and sit on the anther. So when it comes and sits on the anther, the pollen grains will start to stick on the body of the butterfly. So once the pollen grain sticks on the body of the butterfly again moves up and it will sit on this particular stigma. The pollen grains will get deposited on the stigma of the same flower. So it is easy pollination. So that is why it is also called as self-pollination. So chasmogamous flowers, they have exposed anthers and the stigma to facilitate self-pollination or autogamy. And next is cleistogamous flowers. So cleistogamous flowers are the flowers which do not open at all. So here you have to understand, in chasmogamous flowers, there are chances of cross-pollination as well. That is, there is chances of xenogamy and Geitonogamy also, cross-pollination as well. Why? Because since the anthers and the stigma are exposed, instead of the pollen grains falling on the stigma of the same flower, they can go and fall on the stigma of another flower of the same plant species. That is why I told you xenogamy and Geitonogamy can also occur in the chasmogamous flower. But in cleistogamous flower, only autogamy or self-pollination will occur. Why? Here, say for example, this is a flower. The petals will not open at all. The flower, it will look like a bud. So it will not open at all. So if it doesn't open, the anther and the stigma will be covered by the petals. It will not open, it will be covered. So if it is not open, Can the pollination occur by wind? No, because the wind will not be able to enter into the covering, right? Or into the bud condition, the flower in a bud condition, or the flower that is which does not open at all. So the flowers which do not, in other words, you can understand as the flowers which do not bloom. So what happens here is, obviously the pollination has to occur in the same flower itself. So from here, anther itself to the stigma it will fall. Again, one more pollination to the stigma it will fall. Inside the flower only it will occur. So in cleistogamous flower, only autogamy or self-pollination will occur, but Geitonogamy or Xenogamy will not occur. So this is about autogamy. So in autogamy, the pollens are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. So therefore, it is also called as self-pollination. In the flower itself, in the self, that is in the flower itself, the pollination will occur. So autogamy can occur in chasmogamous flowers as well as cleistogamous flower. In chasmogamous flowers, since the anthers and the pollen grains are exposed to the external conditions, the insects, the pollen grains can be carried by the insects as well as the wind, and they can be deposited onto another flower. So therefore, in chasmogamous flowers, autogamy as well as xenogamy or Geitonogamy can occur. But in the case of cleistogamous flowers, because they do not bloom at all, they are always in a bud form. So therefore, since the anthers and the stigma are not at all exposed to the external conditions, environment, here only self-pollination will occur. So I hope you have understood what autogamy is. So moving further, we'll study about one more kind of pollination that is called as Geitonogamy. So in Geitonogamy, here what happens? The pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of another flower that is present in the same plant. So you'll have a plant. So in the same plant, so in pollination, there is another kind of pollination called as Geitonogamy. So in Geitonogamy, the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of another flower but of the same plant. Say for example, in a plant you have two flowers. So even this flower will also have the anther and it will have the stigma. So anther and the stigma. So from this anther, so from the anther of this particular flower, the pollen grains can fall on the stigma of another flower. But remember, the flower will be of the same plant. Though it is two flower, it is of the same plant. So this is called as Geitonogamy. So Geitonogamy, it's the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower. Or it can be like this, from the anther to the stigma of another flower. So in this particular plant, as you can see, you have one plant but two flowers are there. So if the pollen grains are carried from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant, it is called as Geitonogamy. So there is one more kind of pollination, it is called as Xenogamy. So in Xenogamy, here the pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma of another flower, but another flower of a different plant. So here, if you need to understand better, I will draw two plants. So you have two plants. Two separate plants. So here even this will have the anther and the stigma. So two separate plants from this, the anther of this flower of this particular plant, it will transfer to the stigma. Pollen grains will get transferred. So such kind of pollination is called as xenogamy. So both Geitonogamy and Xenogamy is called as cross-pollination. So here you can see I have a Zerbera plant, two different Zerbera plants. So if the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the flower of a different plant, but remember, it should be of the same species. If it is not of the same species, then the pollen grains will get rejected. This you'll study in detail in the next coming sessions, wherein you'll study about the pollen-pistil interaction. So, say for example, this is the Zerbera plant, and if the pollen grain falls on somewhere on the rose flower, the pollination will occur. The pollen grains will be deposited on the stigma of the flower of the rose plant, but the pollen grains will not germinate and fertilization will not occur. Why? Because it is of a different species. So therefore, in xenogamy, you have the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of two flowers of the separate plant of the same species. So mentioning of the same species is very, very important. So this is about xenogamy. So in pollination, it is of three types. One is autogamy, Geitonogamy and Xenogamy. So next, moving further, we'll study about agents of pollination. So we learned all the different types of pollination. So if pollination has to occur, or if the pollen grains have to be carried from the anther to the stigma, various sources are needed. So they are called as agents. So under agents of pollination, there are two types of pollinators. One are the abiotic agents and the other one is the biotic agent. So first we'll study about the abiotic agents that bring about the pollination. So abiotic agents means those abiotic, they don't have life. For example, in this case, wind and water, they are the abiotic agents. They don't have life. That is why they are called as abiotic. So wind and water are the most common abiotic agents. So the wind and water are the most common abiotic agents. So first we'll study about wind, how pollination occurs by wind and pollination by water. So if the pollen grains have to be carried by the wind, the pollen grain should have various characters, right? So imagine if a pollen grain is very heavy, it cannot be easily carried by the wind. Or if it is very sticky, and if it is sticky in the sense, if it is sticking to the anther, or if it is glued too much to the anther, it is difficult for the wind to carry them, or the wind currents to carry the pollen grains. So that is why pollen grains, they are designed, or they have been created, or they have a special characteristic, especially if they are to be pollinated by the wind. So we will study what are the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers. So the pollen grains, or in a flower, if the pollination is by wind, then the pollen grains will have certain characteristics, such as the pollen grains, they will be light and they should be non-sticky. I told you, if they are heavy, then they cannot float easily in the or fly easily in the wind current. So that is why they should be light and they should not be too much sticky. If they are too much sticky, then 2 or 3 pollen grains be in clumps or in groups. So therefore, they will become heavy. So it cannot be easily carried by the wind. That is why it should not be sticky. That is why they should be non-sticky, and the stamens, they should be well exposed. Why they should be well exposed? Because if they are covered by the petals or the other flower parts, if the stamens are not, or if the anthers are not exposed, then the wind cannot easily swipe off or carry the pollen grains. That is why they should be well exposed. The stamens, especially the anthers, should be well exposed. And the stigma, they are large and feathery. So stamens are well exposed. Okay, the wind can carry the stamens easily, or carry the pollen grains easily from the stamen to the stigma. So the stigma, it is the receptive organ now. So what is receptive organ? So receptive organ means the one that receives. So in this case, the one that is receiving the pollen grain is the receptive organ, which is the stigma. So therefore, if it has to receive the pollen grains, it should have a larger area, right? So that is why the stigma will be large, and also it is feathery. So feathery, why? Because usually you see whichever thing or cloth material that has large number of frills in it, like woolen kind, so something like feathery kind, it will attract dust, right? Similarly here, that is why if the stigma is also feathery, it will attract, or it will capture too much of the pollen grains. So therefore, next fertilization, chances of fertilization, successful fertilization is favored. That is why. So therefore, the pollen grain should be light and non-sticky, the stamens should be well exposed, and the stigma should be large and feathery. So stigma, why it should be large and feathery? So that it can capture as much as the pollen grains that are traveling by the wind. So if it is insect pollination, the insect will directly go and sit on the stigma and it will drop the pollen grains on that. So it is easy. But in the case of wind, the wind will simply just carry the pollen grains. It is the function of the stigma to sweep the pollen grains from the wind, right? So that is why if it is fan-like and it is moving easily in the wind currents, so whatever pollen grains are traveling in the wind, it will be easily able to capture the pollen grain. So that is why the stigma should be large and feathery. The wind pollinated flowers, they have a single ovule, and in each ovary they have a single ovule, that is only one ovule is being present, and therefore they have a packed inflorescence. So one ovule it is present. So the chances are 50-50. Either the pollen grain may fall on the stigma or they may not fall on the stigma. So that is why if only one ovule is present in each flower, the chances of fertilization or the dropping of the pollen grain on the stigma is very, very less. So in order to avoid that, usually wind pollinated flowers, they will be in groups, which is called as inflorescence. So they will be in groups. So you can see here, the flowers are in groups. It is called as an inflorescence. So why they are in groups? Because in each flower, you have only one single ovule. So say for example, in that particular inflorescence, there is 10 flowers, then 10 ovules will be there. So that is why, to make the chances of pollination a success, that is why usually wind pollinated flowers will be in the form of groups, that is called as inflorescence. So this point is very important. So flowers of the wind pollinated plants, they have a single ovule, and a single ovule in each ovary. That is why they have a packed inflorescence. The best example for wind pollinated plant is a grass family. So you might have seen in grasses, very tiny flowers they will have in group, right? So why? Because so that easy pollination can occur. So here given an image wherein you can see that I told you the pollen grain should be light and non-sticky. So that is why they are very light and they are almost feathery. So that if it is feathery, if it has like wing-like structures, can you see? So that it can be, they are winged. Most of the wind pollinated flowers, the pollen grains, they are winged. Why? Because so that these pollen grains, they can be carried easily in the wind currents, and also they are usually feathery. So you can see here the pollen grains, they are feathery. So this is about the characteristics of a wind pollinated flower. So next we'll study about the characteristics of water pollinated flowers. So in most of the aquatic plants, usually the flowers, they will be above the water level. They will not be submerged inside the water. Even if the male flower is submerged inside the water, the female flower will be above the water. Because if it is inside the water, then chances of fertilization is very, very minimal. That is why in majority of the aquatic plants, or in the water plants, the flowers, they emerge above the level of water and they are pollinated. And since the flowers, they emerge above the level of water, the best example is lotus. Have you seen the lotus plant, right? The flower is always above the level of water. So that is why in water pollinated flowers, it is not necessary that only the water should be a agent for pollination. Even pollination can occur by wind as well as insects also. Why? Because the flowers are always above the water level. So the best example is water hyacinth and water lily. So water lily, it is a kind of it also looks like a lotus, but it is a smaller version of the lotus. So that is nothing but the water lily. So the female flowers, they reach the surface of the water. Why? Because they have a long stalk, or it is called as the pedicel. So the female flower, they reach the surface of the water by a long stalk, and the pollen grains are released to the surface of the water. So you can see here clearly, this is the male flower. The male flower, then here top you have the female flower. Can you see the stalk of the flower? It is very lengthy stalk. Lengthy stalk. Why it is lengthy? To hold the flower above the water surface. That is why it is lengthy. So the male flowers will spurt out, or it will burst out the pollen grains to the top of the water so that the female flower gets fertilized. So that is what happens. So the female flower, they reach the surface of the water by long stalk, and the pollen grains, they get released to the surface of the water. So this is how water pollination occurs in Vallisneria. So in Vallisneria, the female flowers, if you see, they have a long stalk which holds the flower above the surface of the water, so that when the male flower, that is the anther present in the male flower, when it releases the pollen grain with great force, it will just move. And I told you the pollen grains are light, so they will not sink into the bottom of the water. They will move to the surface of the water because their buoyancy is very, very less. That is why it will move to the surface of the water. In the water current, it will travel towards the female flower. Therefore, the pollination will be completed. So that process is seen in Vallisneria. So the best example for water pollinated flower is Vallisneria. And there are some characteristics in the pollen grains of the water pollinated flowers. One of the best characteristic is that they are long. So I hope you have seen, if something with a ribbon like, it will float easily, right? So that is why they are long and ribbon like. The best example is a kite. So in the tail of a kite, you give a ribbon, you tie ribbon so that it can float easily in the air. Similarly here also in water, to make them move easily to the surface of the water and to float in the water, they have a long, and they are usually, the pollen grains are long and ribbon like. The best example is this long and ribbon like pollen grains you can see in the seagrass. And not just that, since the pollen grains in water pollinated flowers, they are always in water. Why? Because obviously water pollinated flowers occur in hydrophytes. They are the plants that reside or that dwell in the water, right? So always the pollen grains will be exposed to the water. They are in the water. So imagine you have a seed. Soak the seed in water for 2 days, it will germinate fine, everything will be fine. For another week you soak it in water, it will start to rot, right? So imagine what will happen to the pollen grain that are present in the hydrophytes, or the plants that live in water. Always they are in water. So in order to protect those pollen grains from the water, or in order to keep the pollen grains dry, these pollen grains, they are covered by mucilaginous sheath. So that mucilaginous sheath, it acts like a gel which will not allow the water to enter into the pollen grain, or it will repel the water. Therefore, the pollen grain will always remain dry. So it will prevent the wetting of the pollen grain. So these are the characteristics of the water pollinated flowers. So next, moving on to the biotic agents. So we studied about the abiotic agent, wherein we studied about what pollination by water and pollination by wind. So next we'll move on to the biotic agents. So in the biotic agents, biotic, something that has life. So in this case, animals as well as the insects are the ones which bring about the pollination. So animals are the biotic agents of pollination. So under this, we'll study about pollination by insects, because in animals, insects are the ones which bring about majority of the pollination. So bees, butterflies, then flies, then beetles, wasps, ants, and even moths. Moths, they are just like butterflies, but they are usually brown in color. They are pale colored. They are not colorful like the butterflies. So moths, they are the insects that help in pollination. So biotic agents are the agents that have life. So animals, especially the insects such as the bees, the butterflies, the beetles, the moths, the wasps, ants, numerous insects, they are the one that help in the pollination. And among all these insects, bees are the dominant pollinators. Every time you see a flower, you can see a bee buzzing around it. Why? To suck in nectar, right? Because the bees, they build a honeycomb wherein they use the nectar or the honey as a food source for the developing larvae, whatever is there. So that is why bees keep on visiting the flower. So when they visit the flower, the pollen grains will stick on their body, their antenna, their legs, their thorax, or whatever region in the body parts, it will stick on to them. And when they visit another flower to feed on the nectar, they deposit the pollen grain in that particular flower. So that is why the bees are the dominant pollinators when compared to all the other insects. So even biotic agents, they have some characteristics. So we'll study what are the characteristics of insect pollinated flowers. So usually insect pollinated flowers, they should be large, they should be colorful, they should be fragrant, and they should be rich in nectar. Large because large colorful petals. You always see a small flower, it is quite less attractive. But imagine if a flower has very large petals and if it has like good scent, good bright color and abundant nectar present in it, then the bees or the insects usually visit them. Why? Because larger the size of the petal or larger the flower, the bees or the insects will have area to sit on the flower and feed on the nectar, right? So that is why the insect pollinated flowers, they are usually large, they are colorful, they release a quite pleasant fragrance, so that because of the fragrance, the insects will come and visit, and also they are rich in nectar. So nectar is very important for the bees, right? Because the bees, they usually visit the flowers to feed on the nectar. And the flowers, if they are small, so always all the flowers, they won't be large, right? You have tiny beautiful flowers as well, right? So here, if the flowers are small, they are arranged in inflorescence. So inflorescence is nothing but group of flowers. So if you have a stalk like this, so if you have a stalk, in this you have very small flowers arranged in groups. So this is called as inflorescence. Inflorescence. So this is nothing but called as inflorescence. So if the flowers are small, they are usually arranged in groups or in clusters, and they are called as inflorescence. So flowers that are small, they are arranged in inflorescence. And flowers which are pollinated by flies and beetles, if you see flies, the best example is the house fly. Do they come and sit on your perfume bottles or somewhere else? No, they don't like pleasant smell. Wherever there is a foul odor or a bad smell, they visit such areas, right? So that is why, to attract flies and beetles, the flowers they secrete a foul odor or a bad smell. They secrete a bad smell or a foul odor. Taking that smell or the foul odor, the flies and the beetles, they will come and sit on the flower, therefore favoring pollination. And next is the pollen grains and the stigmatic surface should be sticky. Why it should be sticky? So the insect will go and sit on one flower to feed on the nectar. So when it is feeding on the nectar, obviously it will place its leg or its whole body will be in contact with the stamens or the anther. So whatever pollen grains are there on the anther, it will stick onto the body of the insect, right? How will it stick? It should be sticky. Only if it is sticky, it is possible for the pollen grains to stick on the body of the insect, or it should be hairy, or the insect should have a hairy thorax or a hairy antenna, all such things. So that is why the pollen grains and the stigmatic surface should be sticky. So now the pollen grains will stick on the insect because it is sticky. So the insect will then carry the pollen grains when it goes to feed on another flower and will deposit the pollen grains on that particular flower. So in that flower, the stigma should be sticky or it should be hairy, so that when the pollen grains are dusted on that particular stigma, it should be able to receive or capture the stigma, right? So that is why the stigma should also be sticky as well as the pollen grain should also be sticky. So these are the characteristics of insect pollinated flowers. So the insect pollinated flowers, they should be large, they should be of bright colors, they should have a good fragrance, and they should have abundant nectar in them for the insects to feed on them. And apart from that, if the flowers are small, they will always be in groups or clusters called as inflorescence. And if pollination is by flies or insects or flies or beetles in particular, then the flowers usually they will secrete a very bad smell or a foul odor. And next, the pollen grain as well as the stigmatic surface of the stigma, it should be sticky. So these are the characteristics of the insect pollinated flowers. So next we'll study about the rewards offered to the insects by the insect pollinated flowers. So will the insect go and sit on the flower simply? No, right? You should give it a reward. It's just like your parents making you study and making you score good marks. They will bribe you. So what will they do? They will, to make you happy, to make you more interested towards the studies, they will say, I will buy you something so that if you score good marks in the coming exam, I will buy you something of your choice, whichever you want. So thinking of that reward which you'll get because of scoring good marks, you'll start to study well, right? Even here, the same way, thinking of the reward in the flower. So what is the reward present in the flower? It is the nectar, right? So thinking of the nectar as a reward, the what is that? The insects will go and sit on the flower. So we'll study what are the rewards offered by the flower to the insects to get it pollinated. So this is a give and take relationship. It's the flower will give the insects nectar, and in turn the insects will transfer the pollen grain from one particular flower to the other flower so that seeds can be set which will be used further to generate a new batch of plants. So this is how it takes place. So what are the rewards? We'll just study. So usually they offer nectar and pollen grain. So insects usually feed on the nectar and the pollen grain. So they visit the plant only because nectar and pollen grain will be available in the flower. The next reward is some species of flowers, they act as a place for the insects, or they act as a home for the insects to deposit the eggs. That is why the insects visit the flower. I told you some of the flowers, if they are large and all that, the insects usually prefer such flowers because so that they can deposit the eggs in the flower and safely the eggs can hatch out, the larvae can come out, and further life cycle of the insect can also be continued. So I'll give you a best example of the moth and an insect called moth and the yucca flower. So you have the yucca flower. So here you can see that this is the yucca flower and this moth the moth, it has visited the yucca flower. Why it has visited the yucca flower? Of course, for feeding on the nectar, but apart from that, it will deposit the eggs in the yucca flower. Like how birds build nest, right, to deposit or to lay their eggs. These insects, they depend on the flower as their home to lay their eggs. So the moth will deposit the eggs on the locule of the ovary. So you know that in the female reproductive part of the flower, that is the basal part of the gynoecium, you have the ovary, right? In the ovary, you have two locules or two cavities. In the cavity, you have the ovule. So in that particular cavity, the cavity itself acts as a nest for the insect. So it will deposit the egg in that particular locule or the cavity. And what happens is the larvae will come out, and the larvae will start to feed on the ovules that are present. That is why in some seeds, no, when you see in the seed itself, the seed will look very nice from outside, but inside there will be insect inside that. Why? Because previously itself the insect had deposited its eggs in the flower. That is why. So in here what happens, the moth, it will deposit its egg in the locule of the ovary of the yucca flower, and when the moth visits the yucca flower to deposit its egg or lay its egg in that particular flower, the pollen grains will stick on the insect. Therefore, pollination will also occur, and when the eggs hatch and the larvae comes out, the flower or the ovule that is present inside the ovary, it will act as a food source for the larvae. So the larvae will start feeding on the ovule. So it is mutualism here. The yucca flower is also benefited, as well as the moth is also benefited. So this is how mutualism occurs here. So this is the reward offered to the insects by the insect pollinated flower. So one is the nectar and the pollen grain is given as a reward. Next one is, it is a safe place for the insects to lay their eggs. So I have explained, giving you the example of a yucca flower. So this was about pollination. So you studied about the different kinds of pollination. That is, you studied xenogamy, you studied about Geitonogamy, and you studied about autogamy. And also you learned what are the different agents of pollination, wherein you studied the biotic agents such as wind and water pollination, and you studied the biotic agent, that is pollination by insect, and you studied about the abiotic agent, that is the pollination by the wind and the water. So in the coming session, we shall discuss about the outbreeding devices. So self-pollination is always not favorable. If self-pollination keeps on occurring, then you will not get a different plant. Evolution of plants will not take place. The same set of plants, generation after generation, will be produced. So in order to avoid that, plants have developed certain outbreeding devices. So what are those outbreeding devices? We'll study in the next coming session. And next, I told you about pollen pistil interaction. So about pollen pistil interaction we'll study in the next session, and also we'll study about artificial hybridization, how artificial hybridization is achieved in order to promote cross-pollination and to prevent self-pollination. We'll study about them, and we'll study about the next fertilization event, that is the second fertilization event or the reproductive event. So we had already studied about the pre-fertilization events. So next we have completed with the pre-fertilization event. So we'll move on to the fertilization event, wherein double fertilization will occur. So all these we'll study in the next coming session. So I hope you have understood this session well. We'll meet in the next sessions. Thank you.